Robinson, who is an emeritus professor of defense analysis at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, and is also affiliated with the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. He just retired from the Naval Postgraduate School and published the book Global Jihad, A Brief History in 2020. I must say that he actually spent 2 months technically writing parts of the book here at the Middle East Institute back in 2019, sorry. So it's a great pleasure to have you back here with us. Without further ado, I'll leave the floor to you. I understand you have slides that you'd like to share with the audience. So we'll first listen to Professor Robinson, and then we'll have a conversation on the book. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Be back at the Middle East Institute here. It's a great honor to be able to present some of the main themes in the book. The book has received some nice recognition from Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy as a book of the year. What I'd like to do over the next 30 or 40 minutes is to, again, lay out some of the main arguments, the main themes in the book, and we'll have, I think, some time for discussion as well. So without further ado, in the book, I essentially make two arguments. One has to do with the understanding of this phenomenon of global jihad, which is not an old phenomenon, right? It really dates from the 1980s for reasons we'll get into. And it's an argument about how to best sort of understand and categorize global jihad. And I make the argument that it is best understood as four quite distinct movements. They're all jihad-based, and by jihad here, I mean the jihad of sayf, the jihad of the sword, which is the way the ideologues that I'm looking at use the term. And they're under the banner of Islam in a globally focused effort. So you have four fairly distinctive movements, all global jihadist, but all with its own kind of ideological formulations and understandings of the world and prescriptions for how to move forward. So we'll go over each of those four iterations or waves, if you will, of global jihad. And again, each of these understands the main problem that the Muslim world is facing in a globally systemic way. This is not a local jihad group, so I'm making the distinction with local jihad groups, which are much more common and been around longer. And then at the end of the book, as I will do towards the end of my remarks today, is ask the so what question. How do we understand this phenomenon in the broader comparative sense? Is this sui generis? Is it something that's just kind of interesting and unique to parts of the Muslim world, or is this something broader? And I make a broader argument that one needs to understand in order sort of to put this in the right the right understanding is what I call, borrowing Ken Jowett's phrase, movements of rage. That global jihad is one form of a movement of rage, and there are other movements of rage in the world over the last century or so, and it makes for kind of interesting comparisons. So we'll get to that in a few minutes. So in the book, in the introduction, of course, I make the case that this phenomenon of global jihad, again, that originated primarily in the 1980s, didn't come out of left field, to use an American expression. It was not something that was just happened all overnight, all of a sudden, but had intellectual and political precursors. And basically looking at several steps along the way. The first is the creation in the 20th century of what we used to call Islamic fundamentalism, but Islamism is now the preferred term. Political Islam, another term that gets used a lot. Islamism, very much a 20th century phenomenon, right? It's very much linked to sort of issues of mass society, anti-imperialism, and other such things. And in terms of dating, when do we see the rise of Islamism? You basically cannot make a good argument that it predates 1928. What happened in 1928? The fellow on the top of the screen there, Hassan al-Banna, an Egyptian school teacher, founds the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood organization. More of a social club in its founding, but develops over time. In part, there's a sort of the second stone along the way, stepping stone, was the failure of, or at least the perceived failure of Islamism to make a change, right? To take power, to implement the construction of some version of an Islamic state, gave rise to, in the 60s and 70s, a series of intellectuals who basically made the argument for the necessity of violence. That in order to advance a cause of building an Islamic state of one sort or another, and there's not a lot of agreement about exactly what that should look like. And here you have a picture in the lower left of Said Qutb. In the Sunni world, Ayatollah Khomeini on the right side there, in the Shia world, and many others, these were not unique people, made the case in the 60s and 70s for the necessity of violent political action in order to grab the levers of power of the state, in order to implement their vision of an Islamic state of some sort. And again, the difference in the book, I describe the difference between Islamists and jihadists or jihadis is over the issue of violence. That is the cornerstone issue. Islamists, it's not that Islamists have always eschewed violence, but it's a tactical necessity from time to time. But in general, it's a political project. For jihadis, that was a non-starter, that the political process in the absence of violent action will essentially lead nowhere. So you need to engage in violence against the state in order to move the ball forward. And then the third stepping stone is the thing that I spend the time looking at in this book, is this offshoot of the jihadi kind of arguments that is global in orientation, right? The vast majority of jihadi groups and argumentation up to that point had been localized over a particular regime, a small stretch of land, something like that. But these now in the 1980s were ideologues, and here again in the bottom right, two pictures, Abdullah Azzam and Abu Musab al-Suri, we'll talk about each of them in a few minutes, made arguments about the systemic global nature of the cause, that this was not something that can be limited to, again, local issues, local regimes, et cetera, but had a global systemic problem that they were addressing. And I won't go into it now, but it's an interesting question about why did this global jihad phenomenon only occur in the Sunni world? There's not a Shia equivalent to the things that I'm describing in this book. And again, that's be an interesting thing to talk about in the Q&A part. All right, so again, I make a case for four specific iterations or waves, if you will, of global jihad. The first one begins in the 1980s. And the specific crisis that launched this first iteration of global jihad was the Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, which actually began a few days before the 1980s began in December of 1979. The key ideologue here, and my friend and colleague Thomas Hegghammer has written a wonderful new biography of Abdullah Azzam, who you see there on the upper right, and down below you see the picture of the Imam of Jihad, the preacher of Jihad. Abdullah Azzam was a Palestinian that grew up under Jordanian rule. Went briefly to Saudi Arabia, and then in the early 80s made his way to Pakistan, Islamabad and Peshawar, Pakistan. His vision and there were a number of innovations. To this day, he is considered one of the sort of the godfather, if you will, of global jihad. But his vision was very specific, and that had to do with occupied Muslim lands. And there was this phrase up there, you see it at the top of the title, Qaida Sulba, which I have not translated, but I talk about the Jihadi International. This phrase, al-Qaida Sulba, was very commonly used by jihadis in Afghanistan and elsewhere in the 1980s. It literally translates into the solid base or the solid foundation, the cornerstone maybe. But the way that Azam used this phrase early in the 1980s was the same way. He was not different from other jihadis. And that was the idea that once we defeat the Soviets, we set up our own state in Afghanistan. And from there, Afghanistan is the solid base. It's the solid foundation or the cornerstone for activities elsewhere in the Muslim world. In the last 2 years of his life, Abdullah Azam reimagined this concept of Qaida Sulba into, again, what I label as a vision of the Jihadi International. Why that phrase? You'll remember the Communist International, the Comintern, that was created back in the 19-teens, 1920s, whose job it was to work with local populations, primarily in Europe, work with these local populations in an attempt to overthrow local bourgeois domination. So this was the Communist International. They didn't do a lot beyond speechifying, but that was at least the idea, that you had a Communist International that would work with local populations to liberate their country from an evil type of rule, in that case, from the bourgeoisie. Azam took that notion, but made it into a jihadi concept, and said, and it was very clear in the upper right-hand picture. That's a picture from the April 1988 magazine, as you say, Majalat Jihad, the Jihad magazine, where he says, what we really mean by al-Qaida Sulba is not the solid base of territory, but instead a pious warrior class, that we need to create a pious warrior class of Muslims that will do elsewhere in the world what we did in Afghanistan. And that is this pious warrior class will come from different Muslim countries around the world. And they will train and become, experts not just in Islam and Islamic theology, but in the, in the black arts of guerrilla warfare, etc. And they would travel the world and work with local populations to liberate their country from non-Muslim rule, from apostate rule, essentially. So when you look in the 1980s, there are a dozen or so places around the world that this concept would apply to, right? First in Afghanistan, finishing up the business of throwing off Soviet rule. He was very clear that Palestine was next on his list, again, him being ethnically a Palestinian. And then after that, the imagination runs wild. He talked about the 5 republics in Central Asia a bit, who were, the occupation by Moscow of these traditionally Muslim lands. He talked about Kashmir in northern India as occupied by the Hindu state, Mindanao in the southern Philippines, again, occupied by Catholic Manila, etc. So a dozen or so of these places around the world that were historically Muslim lands that were then run, or ihtilal was the word he used, occupied by some non-Muslim apostate power. So this was his main contribution, this notion of Jihadi International, to take that Afghan model and apply it globally to liberate lands around the Muslim world. He got into other things, again, for the sake of time, I won't get into it here, but Tawheed Amali that you see here, which means the action, Tawheed, that essentially is like the Trotsky notion of a jihad, armed jihad, jihad as-sayf, as a permanent revolution, not something that was episodic, which is the traditional interpretation of jihad, of armed jihad, right? It's episodic, it has a beginning, has an end. But you had Said Qutb, even in the 1960s, talking about permanent jihad, but not really giving us a good philosophical reason why we should think of jihad, armed jihad, as a permanent state of nature, as opposed to an episodic event. In the same way in English, we talk about revolutions, right? In France and elsewhere, that they have a beginning, they have an end, they're not always there. Azam was the most prolific popularizer of the Afghan jihad in the 1980s. He traveled the world, came to the United States on a couple of occasions to raise money and awareness of the Afghan jihad, traveled throughout the Arab world and Europe. I'm not sure he ever made it to Singapore, but he did do a lot of traveling and, again, popularizing of the Afghan jihad. So this wave, I date to 1990. So what happens in 1989 and 1990? Two things that essentially end this way of thinking about this novel, unique, first time that it was thought about as a global jihad. Two things happened. One, in 1989, Abdullah Azam was assassinated in Peshawar, Pakistan, by folks who have never claimed credit. And in 1990, in August 2nd of 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. His colleague, Azam's colleague in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden, reached out, and he was the bin Laden family, and Osama bin Laden was very close to a lot of high officials in Saudi Arabia. Reached out and said, look, don't bring in the Americans and these other, apostate countries to liberate Kuwait. Let's do the Jihadi International instead. Let's do the Azam model or the Afghan model in Kuwait. So Osama bin Laden, will raise 100,000 mujahideen from primarily the Arab world for bin Laden. And we will liberate Kuwait that way. And the Saudis, of course, said no to that offer. Azam, the biggest proponent, had been killed a few months earlier in November of '89. And so this first wave or first iteration of global jihad essentially went away at that point. You'll always find a few true believers out there, but effectively went away. One last point about Azam, which makes him different. Not very many high-ranking clerics are proponents of this kind of armed jihad, global jihad. Or even local versions of jihad. Middle to lower ranking clerics, you can usually find a few that will support your cause, but not high ranking ones. Azam actually had a doctorate in Islamic jurisprudence from Al-Azhar in Cairo, which is of course the noose of the National University of Singapore equivalent in the Muslim world as sort of the best seminary out there to get your doctorate from. So he actually had these kind of credentials that very few of the ideologues that I'm talking about hold. All right. The second wave, and the one that the Americans certainly know the best, is what I call the America First or the far enemy wave or iteration. And this is best understood or known through Osama bin Laden and al-Qaida. Very different origins, very different sort of prescription of what the problem is and how do we go forward in the world. The crisis here was not the occupation of historically Muslim lands by non-Muslim powers. The crisis was the durability of these, what he would view as apostate regimes in Saudi Arabia and Egypt and elsewhere, that they kept staying in power. And at the same time, again, he's writing in the 1990s. He's not a global jihadi when he's working in Afghanistan in the 1980s, but he becomes one in the mid-1990s. And part of the reason why is he sees this expanding military footprint of the U.S. in the Middle East, in the Persian Gulf area in particular, and basically connects the dots, saying, look, those two things are connected: the durability of these local apostate regimes and the growing in the post-Cold War era, and when the U.S. had something of a hegemonic position in the region, the growing military footprint in the region. So his notion of global jihad was to drive the Americans out of all of the Islamic world eventually, beginning in the Gulf, expanding out from there. And in order to make this ideological argument. He goes back to the fellow that you see on the screen right there. Do I get a little arrow here? Nope, never mind. Muhammad Abdussalam Faraj, or Farag, if you want, an Egyptian jihadi who was the head of the group that assassinated Anwar Sadat in 1981. And Faraj had written this, so you see the cover of the book in the lower right, Al-Farida al-Ghaiba, Al-Farida al-Ghaiba, the neglected duty or the hidden obligation, by which he meant armed jihad to overthrow, this is sort of the Takfiri argument, to overthrow local anti-Islamic regimes, beginning in Cairo, right, beginning in Egypt, which is the ideological justification for the assassination of Sadat. And Faraj comes up with this dichotomy of near enemy, far enemy, right? This is not an old Islamic tradition or anything like that. This is a dichotomy that Faraj came up with in 1979 to say that we want to focus on the near enemy being the regime in Cairo, because if we focus on the far enemy, which for Faraj was Israel, we probably won't succeed, and if we do, the local regimes will take all the credit for it. So we have limited manpower, limited resources. We need to focus on the near enemy instead of the far enemy. Bin Laden comes along and said, Faraj had a good idea, but he got it wrong. He got it exactly 180 degrees wrong. And that is, in order to have success against near enemy regimes, your local enemy, you have to drive away the far enemy, because the far enemy is what keeps these near enemy regimes alive, keeps them up. You know, we can assassinate Sadat or, you know, whatever. We can punch people in the face, and the regimes may wobble a bit, but they always right themselves. And why do they right themselves? They do it because of the Americans. The American support is a sort of the weight at the bottom of this doll that, you know, brings it back up every time. So we have to focus our energy on driving the far enemy out of the region in order for the near enemy, these local regimes, to become vulnerable. So that was, again, a very different kind of view of the world and the problem, main problem that Azam had, right? Very, very different from each other. And this is why you see, beginning in 1998, with the attacks on the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, the attack on the USS Cole in Aden Harbor, and then ultimately, of course, the 9/11 attacks in 2001 in the United States. These were all done under this rubric of the America first, going after America first. And once you drive them out of the region, then these local regimes will become much more vulnerable. Again, other interesting things out of Bin Laden, but I think that America first, far enemy first argument was his really unique contribution to the jihadi strategic studies, if you will. All right, the third wave is the ISIS caliphate. Well, I should say the dating here. 1996. What happens in 1996? Well, some people, my colleague Fawaz Gerges, talks about 1995 being the key year. But sometime in the mid-90s, 96 is when the first major document that begins to outline a far enemy argument by Osama bin Laden gets made in actually an oral speech in the Hindu Kush that gets put pen to paper, and there's a whole history behind that. But anyway, 1996, he makes this declaration, not a fatwa, but a declaration about both the Americans and the Saudis. He's still kind of one foot in the near enemy regime. But it's in the mid-90s where this kind of argument starts to take place. So there's a 5 or 6 year gap of where there's not much going on in terms of global jihad movement. But it starts up again in the mid-90s again, and in the 1998 fatwa, which was in fact titled a fatwa to kill all Americans. The first, or the 1998 document gets announced, for those that read Arabic, in Quds al-Arabi, headline there, the top headline talks about bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, and Rifat Taha, who was another jihadi from Egypt. issue this fatwa to kill Americans fi kul makan in any location around the world, no distinction between military and civilian. So this was a call for the mass slaughter of 300+ million Americans by bin Laden. So when I talk about calls for nihilistic violence later in a few minutes, this would be a good example of a call for nihilistic over-the-top violence. All right. So the third wave or third iteration of global jihad is best known through ISIS, the Caliphate wave. 2003, with the US invasion of Iraq. 2017, I dated not because ISIS has disappeared, but because it no longer controls territory. It doesn't make a claim anymore to having a territorial state that it physically controls. That ended with their defeat in Mosul and then in Raqqa so Mosul's Iraq and Raqqa, Syria in 2017, which essentially ended the Dawla Islamiyya, the Islamic State, the territorial state. This wave is by far the largest of the four waves that we're talking about. So there are many key ideologues, many documents, too many to go over here, but let me just mention a few of the kind of ideological innovations that are different, that are distinctive for ISIS that you did not see in the first two. So the immediate crisis or crises were the destruction of the Iraqi state in 2003, and then a few years later in 2011, the destruction, or not the destruction, but the eruption of the Syrian civil war, and that ISIS was able to take full advantage of. Their underlying sort of deeper crisis was not occupied historically Muslim lands, was not the durability of apostate regimes because of that American connection, but was apostasy itself. How do you create a state in which apostasy, sinful behavior, is not possible, or at least is very difficult to do? How do you create this puritanical Islamic state in the heart of the Middle East, right, in Iraq and Syria over the border? It's similar to the old Christian distinction between the city of man, city of God, Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century, that was basically arguing, what's the purpose of the city of man, that is temporal earthly power, is to make the city of God possible, to make living a pious, fully pious lifestyle possible. So the armed forces of the state and the institutions of the state allow for a pious life to happen, at least in their imagination. So this is, again, it's very different from the first two iterations of global jihad, and just a few of their innovations. One is, this is very much the state-building wave of global jihad. It's the only one of the waves that is really focused on building a state, right, in the heart of the Middle East. But it wasn't just another state, right? We have about nearly 200 states around the world that have a seat, or at least recognized by the UN, and different accoutrements of being a recognized modern state. This was a pre-Westphalian state, right? Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, mostly amongst small Germanic states in Central Europe, basically say, look, we need to have a playbook, rules of the game, that we're not basically saying only my kingdom is recognized by God and everything else is a blaspheme to God. Instead, we recognize the basic legitimacy of other states. It doesn't mean we won't go to war with each other, but the basic legitimacy of other states we will recognize. And this is, that was 1648. We still live in a Westphalian world today, where we recognize the basic legitimate. We don't have to agree with them. We go to war with them, but we recognize the basic legitimacy of states around the world. ISIS did not, right? You don't remember ISIS applying for a seat at the United Nations, right? You don't remember ISIS exchanging ambassadors and diplomatic recognition with other countries. Why? Because they didn't. They had no interest. That's what a Westphalian state does. A pre-Westphalian state views its state as the only legitimate state in the world. Everything else is in the eyes of God. And so this makes it very interesting, right? 21st century pre-Westphalian type of state, and that all, what it means. Apocalyptic ideology, I've had colleagues that go into in depth looking at that, end of the world, end times kind of ideology. The city of a small little farming town, actually, of Dabiq in northern Syria. You see the flag, the ISIS flag there, that's at Dabiq, that figures into traditional chiliastic end times discussions, and at least in Sunni Islam. That became a very important town for ISIS to hold it, as it did for a while. The performative violence, again, there's a lot to be said for that. The extreme sectarianism, the storytelling over theology. Let me just make a note of that. ISIS did very little to try and persuade high-ranking ulama, high-ranking clerics around the Muslim world in the legitimacy of its cause. It did a little bit, but not very much. Its public pronouncements and its sort of statements of ideology had much more to do with recruiting that narrow slice, mostly of young Muslim men looking for meaning and adventure in their lives, to come fight for them. That was the dominant theme in their public relations discourse. Not trying to convince the Sheikh al-Azhar and the Mufti of Saudi Arabia and others in the theological legitimacy of their cause. They did almost none of that, frankly, which makes it, again, very, very interesting. The last point that I go into in some detail in the book, I think is very interesting. It's what I call jihadi cool. It's essentially what anarchists in the 19th and early part of the 20th century would refer to as propaganda of the deed, or what Nike Corporation uses in their marketing logo of "just do it," right? Going out and doing something. Let your actions speak louder than your words. Just go full out cool and just do the most amazingly, in many ways, grotesque things. But that becomes part of the allure, right? And it's not just the kind of violence that you can participate in, but the sex slave industry that went along with ISIS as well, that went anywhere from getting you a Muslim wife to literally a sex slave industry that went on. So if you're a young man, this was cool. You could do video game kind of slaughter and be rewarded for it. You would, you get as much sex as you want as well. And, you were celebrated for all of this. So the kind of the jihadi cool propaganda of the deed element, which I take some time exploring in the book. All right, each of these three waves are essentially over. You'll find true believers in all of them, but not a lot, frankly, anymore. The fourth wave is the one I call the Jihad Fardi, or the personal jihad wave. And Jihad Fardi just means personal jihad, which is different, incidentally, again, for those that have studied a little bit of Islamic theology. The Jihad nafs means personal jihad as well. And that is a sort of a religious obligation for self-improvement, self-betterment. To become a better person, the first jihad, to overcome temptation and that sort of thing. Jihad Fardi, again, personal or individual jihad, but what is meant by this is individual of violence done not by a group, but by an individual or small cell that are networked through modern information technology, the internet, social media. And it's through those actions that global jihad survives. So why is this an issue? The crisis in this fourth wave, that again begins about the same time as the third wave, but in Afghanistan, not Iraq, is the destruction of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, at least at the time, in 2001, the end of 2001. And then I think one could also put on top of that the destruction of the Islamic Caliphate, so-called Caliphate, in Syria in 2017. That the deeper problem was the very survival of this global jihad movement that had not been around too long, right? Only in the 1980s, as we discussed. And now, because of the invasion of Afghanistan following the 9/11 terror attacks, according to Abu Musab al-Suri, who is the main ideologue of this fourth wave, the Americans and their allies had been actually pretty darn effective in killing or capturing or putting on the run all of what was a fairly small community of global jihadis that were based in Afghanistan at the time. So Suri, who was a Syrian from Aleppo, who had written extensively on the Syrian civil war, a 900-page book on the Syrian civil war that he had participated in, and he had to go into hiding and into exile in Spain and then in London afterwards. He tasked himself with, and he's oftentimes referred to as an al-Qaida ideologue. I don't think that's actually accurate. I think he's very much a free agent. He's a sort of an independent thinker. For my money, the most interesting of these jihadi ideologues, mostly because he was self-critical of the jihadi movement when it made mistakes, which is a trait that is kind of rare in that community. And he very much a sort of cold-blooded Machiavellian type thinker, and much more systematic in his thinking than most of the other folks that I have mentioned. He wrote the book there, and that's him and the redheaded fellow. He wrote the book there in the upper right, Da'wat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya al-Alamiyya, the call for global Islamic resistance. He wrote that while he was probably most of which was written when he was holed up in Pakistan in 2003, 2004. He got arrested in, I believe it was early 2005, and rendered to the Americans, or given over by the Pakistanis to the Americans, and I don't know what happened to him after that. There's lots of talk he was rendered back to Syria, because that was a common thing the Bush administration did. And if that happened, he's almost certainly dead long ago. So the individual jihad, it's incumbent upon, this is a survival strategy, right? This is not taking over the world or the Muslim world or anything like that. This is like, how do we live to fight another day? And we have this information technology that allows us to do that. And again, it's not just Syria, I'm kind of throwing other stuff in there that similarly minded folks also wrote about. So how do we take advantage of those new information technologies in order to continue these, what are frankly mostly pinpricks, right? That kill a few people at a time, or maybe 10 or 15 people at a time, that don't, they aren't really an existential threat in any significant way, but they keep hope alive, right? Keep the dream alive, and through the use of media can be portrayed as part of a much larger narrative. That's, let me just sort of continue on with this fourth wave. The narrative that he's talking about, Abu Musab al-Suri uses or talks about this concept of narrative extensively in a way that I have not found other, at least earlier jihadi ideologues to do. He actually just uses the word thaqafa, which is just culture in Arabic. But what he means by that is a narrative. It's a narrative that allows people to kind of hear your cause, associate specific acts of violence to this broader cause. And this broader cause is a network, right? It's not a hierarchical organization. Suri actually details the history of jihadi groups, mostly local, but some global, from the early 60s until that period that he's writing, so about 40 years. And he says, look, at all these guys got rolled up by this local police and security forces. It's not difficult to do. You capture one or two guys, you torture them, they spill the beans, you go out and capture more of their colleagues, torture them, and pretty soon the whole group is rolled up or it's insignificant. So it's just not powerful. So how do we create a system, not a hierarchical organization, but a system that allows us to continue to do acts of violence and, again, live to fight another day? And I think probably the most famous line out of this 1,600-page internet book is when he uses this phrase, nizam la tanzim. And again, Arabic speakers know these have the same root. Both these words have the same root, so it's kind of a play on words. But it means system, not organization. How to create a system that can't be rolled up very easily by security forces in this or that country. So again, this has some elements to it, but in the book, what I try and spend some time looking at is what I call a wiki narrative. I coined this term wiki narrative. And that is, it's not a narrative that is linked to one or two or three principal ideologues, but it is an always evolving narrative of thousands of people, thousands of minor ideologues, if you will, just every day, it's kind of every man's jihad, that consistently morphs and evolves, incorporates the newest acts of violence into this broader narrative that makes it look, frankly, more powerful than it probably is from a straight, geostrategic point of view. I don't have time now, but if anybody wants to talk about, I think there's a direct throughput from Frantz Fanon and the Algerian war against the French in the 50s and early 60s to Abu Musab al-Suri and the kind of violence that we saw in ISIS. It's really over-the-top, grotesque kind of violence. I think there's a very straight kind of throughput there, but I'll talk about that later. All right. Let's broaden the aperture a bit then. So here are these four waves, current wave, three mostly former waves. How do we make sense of this community of groups that engage in this sort of violence? I refer to this wave 4 type violence, this call for individual or small cell violence that is not directly linked to an organization, but it is kind of self-radicalized, self-motivated through following an organization, again, given the internet, modern information technologies. The term that is getting increasingly used is stochastic violence or stochastic terror. And if it's focused on civilians, it'll be almost always an act of terrorism, not just violence. This is, and the guy in the middle, you think, I don't recognize him as a famous jihadi. This is Tom Metzger, who was, he just died a year and a half ago or so in California. He resided in Fallbrook, California, down by San Diego for many, many years. He was too radical for the KKK. He was kicked out of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, this white supremacist, through the major white supremacist group in America, because he was, again, even too radical for them. But he and a colleague in the KKK in the 1990s first started thinking through how the internet can be used to advance their cause of white supremacy in the United States. And basically coming up with how is it that we can influence folks, can encourage them to think a certain way and to engage in violence when necessary, but do it in a way that doesn't come back to put us in jail, right? The plausible deniability. So stochastic, when we talk about stochastic, it's a probability term, right? The probability of something happening or not happening. This refers to the acts of violence that are influenced, but not logistically connected to some group. So they're influenced by ISIS or al-Qaida or somebody else, but are not logistically connected. There's no flow of money or plans or training or anything like that. It is inspired violence, when a group like ISIS puts out a new call for violence, as they would do from time to time, if you're in law enforcement or security, you can predict there will be a rise in violent events. But you don't know who is going to be radicalized that week or that month to get in his truck and run over a bunch of pedestrians or bicyclists or whatever. So you can predict an increase in the number of violent attacks, but you can't predict where they're going to happen. At least it's very difficult. In the US, over the last nearly decade, almost all jihadi acts of violence, actually throughout North America, and I'll include Canada here, have been stochastic in nature. They were not undertaken. Now in Europe, it's a mix, but in the United States, it's been all stochastic. And here I have some, starting in the upper left, the Boston Marathon bombings, upper right, this is where this Uzbek fellow got in this truck that you see here, ran over a bunch of bicyclists, killing 8, I think it was, in New York City. Bottom right, this couple in San Bernardino, California, that shot up their office workers. Lower left, the Pulse nightclub bombing in Orlando, Florida, that killed, I believe it was 50 or 51 people. All of them were forms of stochastic terror. In other words, they were inspired by global jihad, essentially, but undertaken by specific individuals that we know of no connection that they had with any particular group out there. So again, the broader question, is this unique? Is this something that is that has only happened in this handful of cases in the Muslim world? And here I make a broader comparative argument. It's a bit provocative about a subset of violent political movements. And I basically say, look, if you look at violent political movements over the last century or so, almost all attach themselves to some ideals of enlightenment, of the Enlightenment. As the slide says, science, liberty, justice, progress, material progress. And so that would apply to a number of Leninist groups, for example. There's Mr. Lenin in the upper left-hand corner. That would apply to all the post-World War II national, or almost all, post-World War II national liberation movements. There's Habib Bourguiba of Tunisia in the lower right. And their national liberation movement was reasonably, it wasn't particularly violent, not by comparison to next door Algeria, but it had some. And I make the argument that even fascist movements, usually fascism is presented as the antithesis to Enlightenment ideals, right? The reaction against Enlightenment ideals in 20th century Europe and beyond. But I make the argument that in terms of material progress, fascism also attaches itself to at least elements of Enlightenment ideals. Mussolini made the case very nicely for me when he basically defined fascism in Italy as making the trains run on time, right? That would be material progress in sort of the human evolution. There's Mussolini. I don't know if anybody been to St. Peter's Square in the Vatican. You have a straight shot view right down to the Tiber River with the Castel on the left, beautiful, open, big boulevard. That big boulevard was the Spina neighborhood in the earlier part, up until 1936. Here's a poster from Italy in the lower left of Mussolini personally beginning the destruction of the Spina neighborhood to open up this broad boulevard in front of St. Peter's Square and to get the view that you have today. So again, it's sort of an element of modern progress, even though it's in the name of fascism. There's a small subset of violent political movements that make no claim to being part of the Enlightenment. This is not what they're about. And here again, drawing on the work of Ken Jowett, who's a political scientist at Berkeley and Stanford earlier, is retired now. I make the argument that this movement of rage phenomenon crosses geographies and crosses cultural boundaries and unites groups together analytically that you wouldn't at first glance think belong together. And there are 3 specific elements here that I go into in the book. One is the call for nihilistic violence, right? All these violent political movements, I mean, they're violent political movements, so they embrace violence, but it's typically strategic violence narrowly defined to advance the cause. Nihilistic violence, and here I'm using the term nihilism in its political, not its philosophical sense. Philosophers would look at nihilism meaning nothingness, meaningless. This is not meaningless violence. This is nihilistic violence in the political sense, the way they, beginning with the Russian anarchists of the 60s, used the term of nihilism, and that is root and branch violence, system destroying violence, just over the top violence. So I mentioned earlier bin Laden's call for the murder of 300+ million Americans. There's an example of a call for nihilistic violence. So these groups that I'll mention in a moment, they all share calls for this really over-the-top kind of end times violence, if you will, which is linked to that second point, an apocalyptic worldview. In other words, we're living in end times. Even the secular sort of Maoist groups have this same kind of notion of end times, that we're going to go through just a hellacious, violent moment in time, and on the other side will be some version of nirvana, right? Some version of the saved world, as it were. Here I again coin another word, gnosicide. Gnosis from the Greek meaning knowledge, the Latin suffix side, the killing of. So the killing of knowledge, the killing of those with knowledge. And one of the things you see in movements of rage is the attack on the educated elite, primarily in the capital city, where most of the educated elites in many countries reside. So they are not the only, but a focus of violence by these movements of rage. And then the third is both a sociology of marginality and a sort of a self-identification of being marginalized by the system, whatever that system is, and wanting to, again, rebel against the system in a rage-based fashion. So other movements of rage that I talk about in the book, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia in the 1970s is probably the sort of the exemplar, right? What was one of the first things the Khmer Rouge did when it came to power was to empty Phnom Penh, right? The capital city. It emptied it, right? It became a ghost town. Why? Because that's where the cultural contamination by these educated elites, that's where it was most pronounced, was in the capital city. So we are going to either kill these people, or we're going to send them off into the killing fields, right? Into agricultural life to die a little bit more slowly than if we just execute them outright. But it led to a genocide in Cambodia. A decade earlier, the Red Guards in China, frankly, were a movement of rage. And I understand the argument, and I get into it about how Mao captured the Red Guards, but they autonomously developed. And again, who were their targets? School principals, the educated elite. The main policy that came out of the Red Guards phenomenon was the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1972. Which led to the shuttering of all universities and many high schools throughout China. It led to the destruction of lots of old temples and religious artifacts, etc. Again, very much, I think, a movement of rage within the broader Chinese communist movement in the 1960s. Boko Haram in Nigeria, before it got on the sort of global jihad bandwagon, at least to a degree. Very much a localized movement of rage. I talk about the Brownshirts as being one of the four key elements in the coalition in Nazi Germany. These were the semi-literate rural thugs in the 1920s and early 1930s in Nazi Germany that were the protectors of Nazi leaders and rallies, right? They were the muscle behind the Nazi movement. 1934, Hitler was in power at this point and gets rid of them. And it's called the Night of the Long Knives. He didn't need them anymore. But up until that point, they were a key component of that Nazi coalition, again, along with several other actors. And I also, again, maybe provocatively compare it to much of the white nationalist movement today that I think fits into this movement of rage. Not everyone across the board, but many of the elements of the white nationalist movement in the United States and elsewhere, I think fit into this same kind of movement of rage categorization. So with that, that's what I have. And I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion. I'm sorry for going a little over.
Thank you very much, Glenn, for this overview, or should I say the trailer of the book. And I highly recommend everyone to read it. And before getting to our colleagues for questions, and for those of you who are on Zoom, if you'd like to ask a question, please write it in the chat box to MEI events, and we'll try as much as possible to ask the question right away here. We have about 20-25 minutes for the Q&A. I'll take the privilege of being the moderator to ask you the first question. And my question actually relates to the third wave, no, the second wave, which is al-Qaida. And, well, so should I turn off the microphone or no, it's okay? Because in the book, you explain, and this might sound like a paradox. You explain that this is the shortest wave. And if I can quote from you, we found this quite fascinating. You say the terror attacks of 9/11 were an audacious, if evil, sucker punch that found its target due to a wealth of dumb luck. And would you say that in retrospect, especially now that we're saying that the global war on terror is over, that we turned the chapter of the war on terror, would you say that there has been too much of an exaggeration on what al-Qaeda represented, that we spent 2 decades looking at al-Qaida as some kind of an existential threat, then it wasn't? Is it what you would like to say here, that's in retrospect, if you look at this phenomenon, the phenomenon of al-Qaida itself was much less important than we thought it was?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say that of the 4 waves, particularly the 3 sort of group-led waves, al-Qaeda was the shortest and the weakest. Shortest in that it was really, they had essentially a 5-year run from 1998 with the East Embassy bombings to essentially by the end of 2003, they were what we came to know as al-Qaeda Central, had effectively been defeated. It didn't mean everybody was captured or killed, but it was a really hollow organization by comparison to what it once was. And if you look at the number of recruits that al-Qaeda had, it wasn't very many. I mean, ISIS had far more recruits to the cause than al-Qaeda did. And I think it's related to, the ideology itself is not particularly engrossing, right? If you're a young Muslim man, for example, or somebody else, attacking the Americans because you want to drive them out of the region, the Middle East, and the Muslim world more broadly, in order to then go after local regimes, the near enemy regimes, that's not an ideology that really grabs you by the lapels and pulls you in. So it always had a problem recruiting members and basically being financially solvent. Again, by comparison to ISIS, al-Qaeda was much smaller and weaker. And again, its moment, it had sort of 5 years in the sun, and that was about it. In the United States, it got most of the attention, I think, for obvious reasons, because of the 9/11 terror attack, right? This was killing nearly 3,000 Americans on a single, not just Americans, or internationals there, on a single day, was the biggest such event in American history. But certainly the largest since Pearl Harbor in 1941, and I believe the largest death count of this kind of, attack on civilians in American history. So you can understand why it got a lot of attention. The point that I was making even back at the time was, don't make al-Qaeda into this 10-foot tall, knowing everything, the omnipresent know everything group that is, makes no mistakes and all. I mean, the way it was getting portrayed is this. It was incredibly evil, but it wasn't incredibly powerful, and it never was incredibly powerful. And its biggest event had a lot of dumb luck, frankly, that made it succeed. So it's a threat. It's a threat you want to deal with, but you don't want to exaggerate the threat either. And so, looking back in hindsight, I think that is still good wisdom that, this is a threat that needed to be dealt with. And I think at least in the early days of going after them in Afghanistan in 2001 was the proper decision. But at the same time, you want to understand, even to this day, you want to understand that threat in comparison to other threats, other things out there in the world, whether it's Russia or China or whatever. You want to be able to right size the threat, and with al-Qaida in particular, I think less so with ISIS, but with al-Qaida in particular, the notion of right sizing the threat didn't take hold for a number of years.
Thank you. Jeremy?
Doctor, I'm very much impressed by the volume. It as an extremely deep running, even without knowing your book, which I definitely will read. And I'm particularly congratulating you for taking the pains of learning Arabic, because you're one of the very few who tackle this topic in full command of the language, which I think is indispensable to understand it. But this carries me to a point, and I follow up on what Jean-Luc said. There is a literature I call jihadology, which has taken root in the past couple of years. Much of what has been born under the aegis of this literature, I think we can look at it discerningly and say some of it is good, some of it is bad. However, and this is my question, don't we fear that just looking at the phenomenon, like looking at the symptoms of an illness, like looking at what are the symptoms of tuberculosis, okay? And stopping short of going deeper and finding out the causes of the illness, the causes of the phenomenon, aren't we afraid that this approach will essentially deprive us from really finding out the root causes, the sociological, economic, and you name it, cultural root causes of terrorism as such? Because we cannot omit to see that jihadism, violent jihadism, sprang up in those countries where all venues for a political solution, a political struggle, were essentially closed. And I don't want to name these countries because the list would be too long. However, I am afraid that looking at the phenomenon only will numb us and might block us from looking further afield. Thank you very much. If you could comment on this.
Yeah, and again, a great question. Thank you for your kind words as well. And I think this is, I mean, it's a right question. In other words, well, we need to get it right. We need to go down the right rabbit hole on this. I think there are some folks that want to explain the commonalities going too far, right? In physics, we have the grand unified theory, right? The gut. And the folks that want to do a grand unified theory of all Islamists and jihadi folks around the world tend to want to find something in the canon of Islam itself that predicts this outcome, which I'm not convinced by those kind of arguments. And the differing root causes from each of these four waves, or what produces each of those waves is quite different, one from the other. And I think that I'm more impressed by that than the commonalities, right? The commonalities revolve around, they make systemic global arguments, and they call for the use of violence under the banner of Islam, right? So 4 iterations I'm talking about all share those two components. Of your broader point, I absolutely agree with, and that is, in countries where the political scene is closed, you're going to have much more of this likelihood of violent. That doesn't have to be jihadi; it can be other kind of groups that are out there. If political redress is not available in normal institutional processes, people will go outside those processes and they won't resort to violence. This is, and it still is my concern in the case of Egypt, for example. there's this long-standing debate about the Muslim Brotherhood in particular, the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, and sort of Islamist groups that are related to that. Are these groups stepping stones to radicalism, to further radicalism, or are they satisficers, right? Satisficing organizations. In other words, to the degree that people want some version of an Islamic state, they'll vote for the Muslim Brotherhood or its equivalent, and that's good enough, right? That kind of takes care of that impulse that they have. For me, at least, the overwhelming evidence is that the Muslim Brotherhood, in most of its iterations at least, is a satisficing organization. It's not a stepping stone for further radicalization. And I mean, the person that would agree with me, I think, right off the bat, would be Ayman al-Zawahiri, who wrote an entire book castigating the Muslim Brotherhood for playing in the system, right? That they need to reject the system, take up arms, and violence against the Egyptian government. Going back to the present day, or since the coup of 2013, it's been impossible in Egypt, and the regime in Cairo has really decimated the Muslim Brotherhood leadership, no question about it. But doing that without opening up the possibilities for just normal kind of redress that people have over various issues, economic, social, et cetera, is an invitation to radicalization. In my mind, it doesn't predict that there's going to be a new global jihad group or argument, but it does open up the door much wider to more radical and violent actions, because the normal kind of institutional redress mechanisms are simply not available. And this worries me about the future of Egypt and frankly other countries that have done similar kinds of things. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I was largely impressed and amazed by the breadth and depth of your research. So thank you again for your presentation. I study sectarianism in Egypt, and it was 2014 when I did the major parts of my dissertation fieldwork. And I could feel broadly, I could feel like within the Egyptian society, the fear that Egyptians feel, like both Muslims and Christians. And I focused on Christian communities, and they were largely even more like fearful of the presence of the ISIS. And even that over 80% of Iraqi Christians, the population of Iraqi Christians decreased significantly during that time period in 2014. It was also deeply concerning. But my comment is more about sociological, because I am a sociologist, and your discussion about the transition from wave 3 to 4 reminds me of the Zygmunt Bauman's discussion on liquid modernity. So by liquid modernity, he talks about how society that we live in right now is largely fragmented. So it has been individualized, and people feel that he doesn't even use the term people in his book. It's all about individuals and how people feel isolated and fragmented in the society. So it's really hard to create kind of a public interest among people. So they are isolated. They are all alone by themselves, of course, with the development of technology. So what is happening with the wave 4 is really concerning to me, because as you mentioned, those violent acts are inspired by jihadists. So, and it's not necessarily religion-driven acts that if we see the terrorist acts happening in different parts of the world. So I think in that regard, I think it's more concerning to see how this global jihadi activism will spread across the world. So yes, this is more about the sociological comments that I wanted to make, because that resonates a lot with the recent discussion on liquid modernity that sociologists have been talking a lot. And I wonder if there are some online questions, but I would also love to hear more about why not Shia communities that we don't see global jihadism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and great questions. There have been a number of interviews with captured ISIS folks, both from the Middle East and from Europe as well. And the thing that stands out for me is, well, a couple of things. One is how little they knew about Islam, right? Just kind of factual knowledge is very superficial, and for many of these folks. So then, well, if they really didn't know very much about Islam and they went and joined ISIS, I mean, that's a pretty big commitment, right? Why? Why did they do it? And almost without fail, there are two answers. One is excitement and the other is meaning, right? Start with meaning. There's a great sense, again, this is overwhelmingly young men that get recruited to ISIS. The issue of meaning, that you're part of something greater than yourself, that you are part of a cause that you don't know much about, but it sounds really cool. I mean, you want it to succeed in some way, shape, or form. So this provision of meaning and camaraderie. Once you show up there, right? There's the old notion that, you know, when you're in the pitched battle, you're not fighting for a cause, you're fighting for the guy next to you, and he's fighting for you, right? And that sort of camaraderie that helps give meaning to a lot of these young men. And people have pointed this out. I talk about this in the book as well. And I just sort of went over it very briefly, it's up on the screen earlier, is how storytelling trumps theology in ISIS, right? That ISIS didn't have much of a theological argument that was persuasive, at least. So when they would get these young men as recruits, instead of indoctrinating them into sort of proper Islamic theology, they would tell stories from sort of the vast Islamic canon of victors shedding the blood of others and taking things totally out of context, perhaps, in many cases. But it was that storytelling that helped provide the kind of meaning to people that otherwise didn't know very much about the history or theology of Islam. And the other issue that comes up in these interviews again and again and again was a sense of excitement, right? You were doing something really cool that you couldn't get away with in Liverpool or Chechnya or Tunisia, but you can get away with in Iraq and Syria under ISIS control. So that sense of grand adventure that, again, young men were looking for. So yeah, no, I think that's there's the issue of modernity I sort of get into with this movement of rage, which is in many ways a sort of an anti-modern, certainly anti-enlightenment kind of movement. But I think you're right. There's a very interesting sociology that's going on. We were talking about Gilles Capel and Oliver Waugh over lunch today, and you know, this is part of their dispute with each other, is the kind of the sociological argument of why young men join, right? Why did they join the cause? Do they join it because they, as Capel would have it, you know, they seriously believe in this kind of ideological interpretation? Or are they basically young men who would join whatever group is out fighting for whatever cause, you know, when they're 19? And that's fine, right? And that's who they're going to join. It could have been communists yesterday and Maoists, you know, the day before, and it's jihadis today, you know, whatever. It's much more of a sociological as opposed to ideological or ideational, excuse me, approach. Now, the issue of Shiism, I think, is an interesting one. In the Shia world, you had the development of Islamism parallel to the Sunni world. Excuse me. In the Shia world, you had the development of jihadi ideology parallel to the Sunni world at the same time, right? Said Qutb is hanged in 1966 in Egypt. Khomeini gives his 4 lectures on Islamic government in 1970. And at the same time, in the Shia world, not just Khomeini, but Ayatollah Talakani, Ali Shariati, probably the most famous of the Shia ideologues, who was educated not as a theologian, but at the Sorbonne in France. He had a PhD in sociology, if I recall. So you had these parallels: Islamism, Sunni Shia worlds, jihadism, Sunni Shia worlds. But global jihad has only been a Sunni phenomenon. It has not been a Shia phenomenon. The way I understand that is through the Islamic Republic of Iran, that the state based in Tehran has essentially captured the market on radical interpretations of Shi'i Islam. So if you want to effectively kind of make that kind of an interpretation, sort of a global jihadi interpretation under the banner of Shia Islam, you have to go through Tehran. And Tehran is, it's a pretty powerful state. It will control those things as best it can. And it's hard to be an independent global jihadi Shia group when Tehran is an opponent, right? So it's the state capture of the potential ideological. I don't think there's anything inherent in Shiism that prevents it from having these kinds of ideologies develop. I think that it's very much political and has to do with the capture of ideational power by Tehran in the sort of more radical venues of the Shia world. It's the way I interpret it, at least.
Excuse me. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we have to stop here. But let me again recommend the reading of the book Global Jihad, that was published 2 years ago now with Stanford University Press. As you can hear from the audience, and as we saw with your presentation, the book is quite impressive in terms of both the historical breadth and the let's say the theoretical ambition. So it's really a great pleasure to read it and also to host you for that opportunity. Thank you to our audience, both here at the Institute and on Zoom. And again, thank you for being with us today, Professor Robinson.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.